Welcome to another broadcast from MindsYourHealthcast.com. The broadcast I'm going to begin today was actually, I introduced it last time, about beliefs and paradigms. We brought up the concept of paradigms, you will remember, which is a box that encloses what you believe, and everything that you don't believe falls outside the box. So in a sense, that paradigm is your construct of reality. Now, I mentioned some videos last time that you might want to watch. However, they, in my mind, I introduced them as paradigm breakers. A paradigm breaker means that when you're exposed to a broader way of thinking or a truth that is obviously true, meaning you're convinced that it's a fact, and it runs contradictory to what you already believe, it puts you into somewhat of a situation where you have to decide, do I want to accept the new belief, which means expanding your paradigm, or do I just push it aside and ignore it and pretend it never existed? And that state, when you are confronted with that, is called the state of cognitive dissonance. You're aware of two different conflicting viewpoints, both which you have thought or do think to be true, or that you realize the new one contradicts the old one. However, for whatever reasons, emotional or otherwise, you choose to hang on to the old. So sometimes they both exist in your mind. And I've talked with people before where one time they would argue one side of a position, not just because they wanted to argue, but because they apparently believed it at that point, and then later they would stand for the opposite position depending on the circumstances that brought it to the foreground. So, this is probably one of the more complex things I've done, because what we want to talk about is it involves life as a whole, from the time you're born until the time you die. What is it that is the running game or program that you're involved in that seems to be moving you from somewhere behind? And in many cases you think you're in charge, when in fact something is in charge, but it may not be what you think it is. To me, it's extremely interesting. I've been studying this for years. I mentioned that I studied at Cleveland Psychiatric Institute many years ago in a program involving Case Western University School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry, and Ashland College Theological Seminary in Ohio. And I had been studying psychology, hypnotherapy, and so forth up to that point, but at that particular point I was immersed into it very heavily, and it's really opened the door to a much broader education. I met some interesting therapists that were doing some really good things, and I met some others who probably would benefit from some tremendous therapy themselves. And unfortunately, in our world today of therapists, there are many people who really have so many of their own problems. They have difficulty in sitting with a client and determining what's the client's problem and what's theirs. In fact, in many cases, they project their problem onto the therapist or onto the patient and try to solve the problem through their client, and or make their client's problem their problem. It back and forth. In other words, they have problems differentiating, getting into something called ego boundaries, and they don't know where they end sometimes, and the client-patient begins as far as their problems. And unfortunately, neither of the two get very far, because as a rule, a patient or client with a lot of problems isn't the best therapist for a therapist with a lot of problems, and vice versa. And so I'm not saying they're all like that, but I know there's some out there because I've met some of them. But I'm not here to critique the profession because the same thing exists in every profession. So it's not just the psychotherapist. It's just that somehow we kind of think that if a person is going to do psychotherapy, they ought to have their own mind pretty well ironed out. And we think if somebody's going to practice medicine, they have their own health pretty well ironed out. And if they're going to practice theology, that they have their own spirituality pretty well ironed out. That's what we like to think. Doesn't always happen that way, but basically that's one of those big assumptions that we deal with. And as I say, I've watched it over the years. I've been around enough years on this earth now and dealt with enough people. And there was a time I did psychotherapy and hypnotherapy full time. And I still have to laugh that someone would come in and say, now, what I'm going to say may shock you. And I say, well, it's possible, but I think it would take a lot to shock me. After being in the therapy field a while, you get a pretty good idea of what some of the attitudes are. Now, this program that I'm doing this time will probably take 2 sessions, and I could see the potential for 3. I'll try to avoid that. I know when you get into 3 sessions, it gets really hard to follow all this stuff. And I want to make it comprehensive enough that you kind of get the picture, but not so comprehensive that it scares you away. And there are certain aspects of it that are pretty straightforward and very simple. It's just you may never have thought about it that way. And so we're going to present it in such a way that it catches your attention and opens the door for yourself to get involved into some further exploration of your own limitations and capabilities. I guess that's what we're really looking to do, is to open your thinking and your emotions so that you become free of being imprisoned by either or both. We want you to enjoy your life and to be happy. And to be happy doesn't mean that everything always goes your way, but it definitely means that you're capable of dealing with what comes your way, and therefore a lot more things probably will end up going your way. Okay, so remember, it's beliefs and paradigms breaking free. So these are tools that I have learned that have worked very well with helping a lot of people who were pretty much non-functional. Now remember, I did a 2-year program at Cleveland Psychiatric Institute working with patients within the institution that were hospitalized behind locked doors, and also learning group dynamics. I participated in an ongoing 2-year group dynamic. And that's how you learn group therapy, is actually being a participant. Now, I've been in more than one. On one that I was in, the facilitator, which is a term that you use to refer to the person who's kind of in charge but not in charge. Their job is to just kind of get it started, get people interacting and moving, and then kind of keep it in control in the sense that it doesn't go crazy or somebody doesn't beat somebody senseless as it progresses, but it's kind of an order keeper. The one I was in, however, I'm absolutely convinced that the person in charge needed to be in group therapy and maybe even more intensive therapy. I saw him get extremely angry and yell at everyone because they weren't interacting enough. And that's not the way you facilitate a group. You allow the group to develop its own interaction and interplay. And if it does that, then it's capable of making a lot of change in a lot of people. And I watched people in the other group I participated in, which I thought the person in charge did a very good job. He kept it moving and kept it in order, but he wasn't trying to direct it. And some people came up with some very good observations, and I remember one in particular. I became, over 2 years, of that program pretty good friends with one of the participants who was a minister full-time, and during that 2 years his son was killed tragically. And also he was from the black race, and I'm very careful how I say things anymore. We are in such a race-sensitive period of time now that every statement that's made, even if it's a statement of fact, can be somehow contorted or made into a racial statement. And I want you to know that nothing that I'm talking about in this program is racial in nature, but there are some issues that, to illustrate it, you may have to refer to someone as being Oriental or black or American Indian or whatever, but that's not because you're prejudicial. I have to tell you, I have friends from every race and I have patients from every race, and to me, people are people. I was fortunately not raised as a racist. The town that I grew up in, it just was not an issue. I never heard it brought up. My parents never brought it up. They never made fun of people. And so consequently, I was shocked when I got into the world and realized what a big issue it was, because it was not one of my young life issues, and it's in the young life that those things get programmed in. And so that's part of what you're going to see in this. Okay, so I'm saying that this guy was very pleasant, outgoing, very large man. He was probably 6'3", 4", and maybe weighed 225 to 240 pounds. But he was very vivacious and friendly. And so after a little while of the group, we became pretty good friends. And as happens in a group where there is a period of time set, in this case it was 2 years, at the end of that period of time there's something called a go-around. And the go-around means that each person talks about what some of the major issues or factors that they became aware of or learned or knew now they had to deal with as a consequence of the group experience. Now, in a group situation, there's a lot more energy and a lot of dynamics go on, and many times people progress much faster in a group than they do on face-to-face therapy, because they begin to realize, hey, other people have problems too, and hey, they're not doing so well with their problems. And I guess maybe some of my attitudes aren't as bad as I thought they were, and maybe some are a whole lot worse than I thought they were. But the interesting thing is, in a group you get feedback from other people. It's not a therapist doing it, but it's each other, and you're beginning to understand how you come across. Anyhow, I still remember the black participant I was talking about. There were two in the group, and it was male and female in the group and so forth. So there were a lot of things going on. And so at the end of the 2 years, when it came around to George, he looked at me and he said, I have learned that black people are prejudiced too. And he said, all these years I have operated on the assumption that white people are prejudiced, and that we are victims of the prejudice. And so as a consequence of this group, he began to realize that he was also part of the problem. He had his own set of prejudices, and I guess maybe becoming friends with me, he began to realize that all white people aren't the same as all black people aren't the same. Or all yellow people, or red people, or brown people. None of them are all the same. Each person has their own issues. And depending on where you were raised, how you were raised, what happened in your early life, makes a big determination of what you are and what you become. And much of it is automatic, and that's what we're going to talk about in this process, because I'm offering you a set of tools that if you can learn to use these tools, they can start opening some doors to enhance and improve your life and get rid of a lot of misery. because I would say the bulk of the misery that we experience is because of our own selves. You know, it's not the guy over there that's my problem. Sometimes it probably more than sometimes, all the time, it requires looking into a mirror and saying, all these people aren't my problem. There's my problem, me. And once you can come to grips with the fact that you're likely your own major problem, then a lot of other problems will kind of retire because they're no longer required to maintain the position that you have assumed in your life. Now, I've got a boatload of stuff, and I don't want to make it too complex, but I want to get across the message of how we develop all of these beliefs and paradigms that, in a sense, tend to run our life. And it doesn't mean people are bad people, it just means that people have some bad things happen in their early life, either by the parents they end up getting, or by the people they associate with, or society as a whole. A lot of things develop that lead to problems both conscious and unconscious. And of course, the conscious ones are a little bit easier to deal with, but the unconscious ones are so automatic that we don't even give it a thought. It's a priori, which means it's just assumed to be true of what the world is like and what people are like and what different types of people are like. And so we just respond automatically. So we're going to talk about what sets the stage for this, what brings on all this, what makes us prejudiced. And I've observed some things in my life that demonstrated to me no wonder that prejudices are so difficult to deal with, because they are programmed in at such an early time in your life. And it just now becomes automatic. You don't even think about it. And there's so many behaviors we have that are programmed in at very early life and are so automatic that it just, we know it's true. There's no way it could not be true. And yet, if you really sit down and start to examine the facts, you find that it's totally off the wall. But you grew with the assumption that this is the way it was. And we've talked about it before. Now, the two biggie things that we want to talk about in this, first of all, is transactional analysis, which I think is probably one of the best down-to-earth methods or ways or systems to understand some basics about the human and human behavior and how humans interact with other humans. And I learned about it way back. And a lot of my original training was psychology, psychotherapy, counseling, and at one time I had thought I would go into it full time until I got involved in actually going to a program in New York that kind of opened my eyes to a bigger world yet, and some psychiatrists who had a broader view of the world and so forth. And out of that, it started me on a trek that ultimately led me into what I would call true holistic therapy or medicine, which means you look at the whole person. You don't just look at their physical body, but you look about all the different dimensions of a person that interact to either cause problems with the body or that the body interacts with to cause problems. And so we'll probably mention maybe a little bit about Chinese medicine, but primarily as a structure of understanding, I have not found any better than what I'm going to introduce you to. Now, some of you may have heard about it and maybe even have read a little bit about it, and it's okay. There's a lot more to it than even I could present here on a very basic program. But if you can catch the basic concepts, then you can pursue it on your own. There's a lot you can do on your own. And you'll understand why people become so prejudiced toward people, other people, things, or ideas. And hence we have either prejudices such as racial or paradigms, sociological, I mean, you name it, financial. There's attitudes toward people who are well off versus people who are not well off. I mean, there's no way in this world that you can get out into the world and not begin to notice, if you're paying attention, that it's loaded with prejudices anyhow. Not necessarily toward different races, but economic status, social position, ancestry. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And if you once grasp what's going on, your chances of, over time, alleviating more and more of it so that your eyes are open more. Now, you probably remember that we've talked before about the fact that we have these set of beliefs about the world, and because of those, we then have a set of mind filters that have developed in order to maintain that. And what it means is that in neuro-linguistic programming, which is the other thing we're going to talk about, they talk a lot about the map and the territory, and they talk about mind filters, which enhance or reinforce your beliefs. And so that means that if you have something that your parents have programmed into you that you don't know that they did, because you just assumed your parents are God in the early years, and therefore anything that comes from them automatically is the absolute truth. And you don't ever question it, and it can become a part of you, and you'll see why as we talk about some of this. But anyhow, those beliefs create a set of filters in our mind that distort, delete, and generalize information coming in. So when you generalize, you get that all blank blank are such and such. All men are bad. All women are manipulators. All this, all that. And so we have that generalization. If somebody walks down the street and punches you in the kneecap and it's a midget, then you could conclude, if you generalize, that all midgets are bad because they go around punching the knee. So, I mean, that's just a good example of the type of things that can happen under generalization. And a lot of people operate with a generalization filter, that no matter what comes in, one piece of information suddenly becomes true in every case. And of course that's not true, but that can happen. So that we have distortions. If somebody smiles at you because they're being kind or courteous or social, you may say, well, they're trying to seduce me, or they have a sinister smile and hence they're working on some scheme that they're going to trick or deceive me. So we can distort anything that comes to us through our senses. And then we have the deletions that just shut it out. And I've heard people swear up and down, no, that didn't happen. I was there, I saw, it did not happen. And yet 3 other people were there, saw the same thing and said, yes, it did happen. Now, was that person lying? Well, it's possible they wanted to if they had some other motive for lying. But it's also very possible there was something about that that was not acceptable to their mind, so it just closed it out. It blocked it. So our senses are controlled by our mind filters. And hence, you could sit down at a lie detector and pass the test because you were not lying, that you did not see it. And yet you were there. I mean, that was an obvious fact, you were there, but you didn't see it. And so, or, in the distortion, you can see one thing, but it may remind you of something else, and then all of a sudden you would swear, oh, it was that person. I just read a case recently where a lady who was attacked and raped at knife point, and she viewed the person inches from her face. And she decided there was nothing she could do about what was happening, but she was going to, bit by bit, notice every detail about that person's face so that if she were to see them again, she would no doubt know them for sure, and she could even describe them to a police artist who could draw up a picture based on what she saw. Well, anyhow, at some point along the way, a man was picked up, and she was showing that man in the lineup, and she absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, knew that was the man. And in court, when, again, she was required to identify, absolutely, that was the man, I have no doubt whatsoever. And she was not telling a lie, she was telling the truth. Anyhow, he was convicted and went to prison. Well, a few years later, someone else actually had confessed to the crime while he was in prison, and so the attorneys got a new trial for the man who was convicted. So at the trial, they brought before her the man who had confessed, and she said, no, absolutely, that is not the man. And they brought back the guy who had been convicted, and she said, absolutely, that is the man, I have no doubt whatsoever. He went back to prison. It was only after 11 years in prison and DNA testing came along that when they got a sample from her and tested, it proved beyond a shadow of doubt the man that she absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, had identified was not the man, and the man who had confessed, in fact, was the man. And so now she spent years having to be regretful of the fact that she robbed a man of 11 years of her life because she was so absolutely sure, being that close, that there's no way she could not identify him. And I'm only saying that to say that's a good example of mind filters. I don't know if that makes an impact on you or not. It does to me. I mean, to imagine 11 years of your life destroyed because somebody mind filters somehow messed up her capability of identifying. And many times she was confronted, and she did not ever vary. Yes, that's the man, I have no doubt. So, how do these things get started? You know, what's it all about? Well, as I say, one of the best things that we need to do, I guess, is start way back. As I mentioned, at Cleveland Psychiatric Institute, I studied with a very, very good psychiatrist who had shed a lot of filters and had altered his behavior tremendously over the years, and probably was one of the most uninhibited psychiatrists that I've met. Now, I'm not saying there's not other good ones out there too, but I know there's some pretty bad ones out there, not because they intend to be bad, but because they don't have the capability, because they're trying to deal with their own problems. Anyhow, I had a chance to watch him work, and he's the first pretty one, well, I guess the first that I can think of as far as psychiatrists. I probably had read it someplace, maybe I hadn't, but the impact came when he said, you know, when a child is born, they're physically born. They separate from the mother physically. Now, it's true they make contact with her quite a bit after that, but physically they have been separated. The cord was cut. Now they are a separate being. Now, they may be dependent because they can't take care of themselves and they need the mother for life support, but as far as being an independent physical entity, they are. However, psychologically, they are still stuck together. And for the first 3 years of life, that child, because of ancient programming we have that comes down genetically and or epigenetically, an infant has an automatic reflex that if it's separated from its mother, it means death, because they're totally unable to take care of themselves, especially those first 3 years. Very, very difficult. Not saying it wouldn't be possible, but very difficult. And so what it does, it triggers a fear, a strong fear emotion of death and separation. Okay, so now it depends on how the mother handles the process of the child beginning to separate psychologically at 3 years old. If the child is made to feel dependent, even beyond that first 3 years, made to feel dependent and to not be liked but rejected, a tremendous conflict occurs. Okay? And it's a form of what they now call post-traumatic stress disturbance or syndrome or disease or whatever you want to call it. And that then tells the infant. Now again, we're not talking about them logically figuring it out, because this is occurring on a feeling basis at that point. That child's still working primarily out of the theta brainwave state, which has to do with kind of a reverie, dreamy imagery state, a lot of imagery. And so they don't logically say, oh, I don't think my mother likes me. But a part of their feeling side feels the rejection. Okay, so that acts as an injunction. Okay, now before we go further with that, I'm going to step back a little bit, because there is a psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Clancy McKenzie, who has done thousands and thousands of case studies of people with schizophrenia and very bad emotional problems. And he brings up another issue that relates to this, but occurs usually during the first 3 years. And the reason is because it triggers that same loss, fear of survival feeling when it happens. And that is a lot of times when a child is the oldest child, and then within a year or two after that, a second child is born. Now, depending on the child and depending on how they feel and depending on the mother and a whole lot of factors, that child can experience that separation, because now the mother suddenly, who's been giving all her attention to this child, has another child intervene, and this other child is starting to take a lot of time. So that means that the little bit older child feels abandoned. And again, as I say, we're also individualistic. It depends on what our makeup is, and probably what our pre-birth, meaning our uterine life, was like, and a lot of factors. That child can feel that loss. And even though it's not on a conscious level, they're saying, oh, that baby's taking the attention away from me, their feeling is, uh-oh, at any moment I could be totally separated and die. And so that creates a post-traumatic stress issue that in the background, the child seems to be okay from it later, but down the years, every event that comes along that gives a feeling of rejection goes back and triggers that early state of mind, until finally one day, one event is the final blow, and kaboom, that person is in big trouble. And so he called it delayed post-traumatic stress syndrome, and he was able to establish how it happened and to point out that when someone becomes really psychotic, they may start carrying on in some way, so behaving in a certain way. What he found is that when the break occurs, they go back to that early part of the brain that was behaving the way they were behaving at that age, and their behavior mimics what they were doing and how they were handling the world back at that age. And that's why we see some bizarre behaviors sometimes when people become very psychotic and they break from the bit of reality they've been holding on to and go backward. So the very first thing that sets the stage for a lot of problems is, even before that, is the intrauterine life. Now everybody thinks, oh well, I see all the drama and all the upheaval and all the things that are going on when a mother is carrying a child, family fights, upheavals, her beaten up, you name it, yelling and screaming and carrying on, lots of anger, lots of emotion. That child is already affected intrauterine before they're even born. They start hearing very rapidly, the first of the senses that get activated. So very early in intrauterine life, they're already hearing. They're hearing sounds from the mother, they're hearing the calming of the mother's heartbeat, and if the mother's singing or doing some good relaxing or healthy things, that child is influenced by that. There is a whole group of therapists that have developed the pre-perinatal birth Therapy Association. I don't know that that's the official title, but that's what they do. They study the effects of intrauterine and events that occur around birth. A later therapist by the name of Janov, Janov, developed something called the primal scream, and he was talking about in a difficult birth that we are traumatized also. And so he has people go back and re-experience their birth, and a lot of times they have these terrible screams of all the compression and constriction and tightness and pain and trauma they go through at birth is recorded and is chewing at them in the background, but they don't know it. And so he had some good success with a lot of people that totally changed their life. And the book's still available, called The Primal Scream. You may want to go back and find it and read it. And I think there's been a couple updates on it from the original. But you'll find it fascinating, if that fascinates you. But at any rate, so here we have at this early life, all this stuff can go on that can set the stage for how we approach the rest of our life. And then, now that you are in this world, then the parents become a big influence. One, the mother in the psychological birth that we just talked about. And when that happens with the psychological birth, the child takes on a feeling of okayness or not okayness. Now, that's important because what it means is the child feels, now they aren't logically thinking this out at 3, but they're feeling, I'm not lovable, I'm not acceptable. And how then do I become lovable? How do I get strokes? Now in transactional analysis they talk about strokes and warm fuzzies and so forth. And how do I get positive strokes? Because, you know, it's been proven that a child that's laid in a crib after birth and gets no touch, no attention, will likely not survive. So we have to have strokes. Sometimes it ends up negative strokes from a mother that's got her own bucket of problems, and so even negative strokes are better than no strokes. As they used to say, halitosis is better than no breath at all. Negative strokes are better than none, but that's not what people really want. But they can thrive, if for no other reason, I guess, to grow up and get even with the world. But nonetheless, they can survive. But without any stroking whatsoever, they just shrivel, wither up, and die. Okay, so now what happens is we have an injunction put on the child that says it's not okay to be you. The injunction causes the infant to emotionally accept, I'm not okay, something's wrong with me. Okay, so now if I'm not okay, then I'm either going to get no strokes if the mother's not loaded with negative strokes, and she could be. That's possible. She's on drugs, or there's a lot of problems that could exist. But for the average person, they want to get positive strokes. So if you can't get positive strokes because you're not okay, and hence you're not lovable, then what can you do to become lovable? And that injunction that says it's not okay to be you causes you to feel you're not okay, and therefore I have to choose a way of life that will make me lovable and make me okay, which in transactional analysis is referred to as a script. Now in a minute you'll find out why it's called transactional analysis, but at this point, this is what happens. The child decides to write a play for their life. And in the process of writing that play, they have to decide how they're going to behave, and sometimes they'll pick a character to be like. Could be a fairy tale character like Cinderella. A girl could pick a Cinderella theme for her script, and then she sets out to develop that script by choosing the right costumes, by choosing the right players and choosing the right behaviors to bring it about. And once they choose that, they have sold themselves out as an individual, because whatever they really were and whatever they would really have become, they have substituted for that a new play. They've written this new script. And the script is interesting because it involves something called ego states. It involves something called transactions. It involves choosing a position of victim, persecutor, or rescuer, or some combination thereof. It assumes picking games, which are behaviors that are initiated and played out, that you go away from feeling bad and reinforcing that you're not okay, and several different issues. And so we're going to lay out the basic structure of transactional analysis. However, you might want to get started reading something about it, and so if you go to my website, you can look, and if you don't find it there, you can go to Amazon and find lots of books related to transactional analysis. Now, the originator of the whole system was a psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Eric Berne. And interestingly, he was one of these very conscientious doctors whose goal was to get people well, get them functional. And so he was very open and alert to clues to anything that he might understand or do that could make his success better in helping people become healthy, functional people. And so you can find the books. I saw one in particular. I have this one, the one I just recently went through Amazon, and it's called TA Today, a New Introduction to Transactional Analysis, 2nd edition. So it's like a 2012 edition. It's one of the newest. The original one came out many, many years ago, and copies of the original are still available. They go way, way back, because he first laid this out many, many years ago. So you will find this particular book pretty helpful. In fact, it has on the front cover the 3 ego states and a transaction going on. And once you get a handle on that, you're going to find it very fascinating, because you'll begin to understand that when you have issues with people and you sit down and you start to analyze what happened, you'll see that this structure is a very good structure to understand it, and it's not loaded with technical terms. I mean, psychiatry and psychology and sociology and all of these specialties have developed their own nomenclature, their own names for everything. And so if you're going to be a part of the inner group, then you have to know those names, and when you know those names, then you can converse with the inner group, but the outside group doesn't know what you're talking about unless they spend a lot of time trying to learn the new vocabulary. And of course, it's not true just with psychology. It's true with law. It's true with medicine. It's true with theology. It just goes on down the line. Every group likes to invent, in many cases, their own vocabulary, or if not, and they use normal words, then they give their own particular definition. And so that's one of the, well, I won't say it, but it's one of the games that sometimes is played on a society basis. We have something exclusive that you don't have, and if you want to find out about it, you're going to have to pay some money to find out. And so I hate to say that, but sometimes I think that's the case. Now, in the case of Eric Berne, he did not do that. He made it as simple as possible, and here's what happened that triggered him in the first place, at least according to what he says. So I think that probably that's the most reliable source, since he's the one that said what he said. I guess he probably knew what he said and what he thought at the time. So what happened was he had a client who was an attorney and had been coming to him for a while, and was coming along with therapy, but he had a ways to go. And so on one occasion, Eric Berne made a statement or asked a question to his client, And his client suddenly popped out an answer like that. And then immediately following that, he said, "Oh, that's my child speaking." And Eric Burns' brain went clink, clink, clink. Something's going on here. Let's see. He's speaking from his child. I wonder what the implications of that are. And so he started paying more attention. And as time went on, he found out that basically we have three primary ego states that we function from or in some mixture of. And those he called the parent, the adult, and the child, or PAC for short. And so when you see any literature involving transactional analysis, you'll always see these little circles with P's, A's, and C's in them, and arranged into some type of configuration. Now, in a pure state, a person will have a distinct parent ego state, a distinct adult ego state, and a distinct child ego state. And those ego states have something to do with the way we behave when we're in that state and the way we feel and think. So it's as though at that moment we are operating out of that ego state, if it's a pure state, and if the circumstances are appropriate for us to operate in that state. In other words, they might not be appropriate, and it might not be the right ego state for the occasion. But I think as you begin to look at this, it's going to make so much sense that you're going to want to say, hey, I need to know more about this. Now, as I say, I've worked with it over the years, and occasionally still with patients, I'll go through the basic structure of it so they can get a feel, because they're trying to deal with stuff and they seem to be having trouble. And so this opens a door for them to be able to do that. Now, as I say, in the pure state, the parent would be a separate ego state, the adult would be a separate ego state, and the child would be a separate ego state. These all have to do with the ways we address the world and other people, are these ego states, because it's the interaction between these ego states that creates transactions, hence the name transactional analysis, which means you sit down with somebody and you analyze the transactions that they go through when they're interacting with other people. Now, as I say, it is so common sense, and it fits so well with the terminology that you have no trouble remembering what this is all about. Now, the parent ego state generally is divided into two types, generally. One is called the critical parent, and the other is called the nurturing or supportive parent. And I'm sure you've experienced both. As a child, you probably, most of the time, if you're dealing with the average mother who's not too overloaded with her own problems, she will be dealing with her child from her nurturing or supportive ego state. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to imagine what a mother would be like who is being nurturing or supportive. But occasionally, something triggers her punitive ego state, or persecuting ego state, or whatever you want to call it, but punitive, or critical. And I think probably maybe critical is a good general, but sometimes it can be punitive and sometimes it can be harder. But they're definitely critical. And so they will, depending on what happened in their life, will determine how their parent ego state developed. That's why you see parents copying behaviors from their parents before, because that's the way they were programmed in those early years of their life, again, at a time when they did not have the critical faculty to discern otherwise. This is loaded into them, almost like loading a program into a computer. It also happens, that's where prejudice are loaded in. And because it's loaded in there, it's automatic. It just takes the right trigger and it pops into play. Now, when the ego state comes into being, it brings the rest of you into harmony with the ego state. You know, if the mother goes into the critical ego state, guess what? She's prepared to slap, punch, spank, yell, or whatever it takes to express it. And it's just so automatic. Zip! Did you ever see a mother switch from a very nurturing state and to ready, you would think she was going to let you have it or maybe even murder you or something if she suddenly made that switch and came across? That's when that was triggered. But that was programmed into her, programmed from her mother. And if the father the same way. In other words, we all have it, male and female. I'm not just picking on mothers. But we can especially relate to the nurturing part from the mother, but it could be from, it can and should be from the father too. So we all have that parent ego state to some degree. Now it's possible to shut one of these down and totally cut it out of the circuit and never go there. Again, depending on what happened to you in your early life and what script you wrote for that. Well, you know, when I grow up, I'm not going to ever treat my kids like that. You know, they get mad at their mother, they get upset. I'm not going to do that. So in their script, they say, I'm not going to do that. However, guess what? When you have parents that abuse kids, and they swear, boy, I'd never do that to my kid. And then when they grow up and have kids, guess what? They abuse them. A lot of the time, unless something has happened to break that pattern. It's so automatic. And if you would ask them after the fact, well gee, I didn't mean that. Well, there's no way I would want to hurt my child. But there it goes, bang. Triggered, and there it comes out. So that's something about the parent ego state. As I said, male and female, but it can be nurturing or it can be critical, and whichever one it is, some can stay locked into more of a critical state, or some can stay locked more into the nurturing state. But the healthy parent can have both of them, but they can be triggered when it's appropriate. You know, you could be critical if you see the kid doing something that's going to destroy something. You know, is it bad to stop him from doing that? No. That's being critical, but it's not being destructive. See, there's a difference between being critical and being destructive. And so that's parent. Adult ego state is the one where the emotions are less and the logic should be greater. Because now we're dealing with facts. Every time I think of adult, I always think of the old Dragnet where Sergeant Friday would always say, we want the facts, man, just give me the facts. No emotion, just whatever it is. You know, if you say, what time is it? That's a question, and there's no emotion tied to it. It's an inquiry, what time is it? And if the other person says it's 3 o'clock, then there's no emotion tied to that. It's the furnishing of data or information. So that actually is a complementary interaction between two people. And we'll talk about that as we get the time here. It looks like we're running out of time real fast, but I hope you're kind of getting to feel that the adult one is how you solve problems. That's how you look at the facts and how you weigh them and how you logically come to a conclusion. Now I have to say that a lot of times when you buy things, you're not using the adult ego state, you're using the child. You say, boy, isn't that pretty and bright red with lots of chrome? I want that. And then after you buy it, somebody says, how come you bought that card? Well, then we go back to our adult ego state and say, well, gee, it's going to be worth much more money whenever I trade it in or sell it, and blah, blah, blah. But those are all justifications for the fact that the child made the decision because it was pretty. Okay, so the adult is pretty easy to understand. The child ego state usually is divided into two general groups also, the natural child and the adaptive or adapted child. Now, the natural child is just a natural child. They're being what a child is, and they're not stuck, but they are freer. But under certain circumstances, they can be made to get into, when I say made, they can be exposed to things that move them into a rebellious child state. And that's one way of adapting to a critical parent, is to be a rebel. So they're the rebellious child. I don't care what you tell them, I'm not going to do it. Or they could be the compliant child. Everything they're told to do, they do. They never resist, they never put up a fight. But that's not the natural child. The natural child may not do what they're told not to do, but they don't necessarily have to like it, and they may even express that they don't like it. But the compliant child just does what they're told. And whether it's fear or whatever that's controlling them, they don't come out. Well, I wouldn't say they don't come out. They down the road can. And I had a neighbor one time years ago. A young man grew up in a family. The father was a bad alcoholic, and he was an abusive, violent alcoholic. And he would come home drunk, beat up the mother and the kid. And so this little boy was compliant. He never resisted. He never rebelled. He just kept going, and so he graduated from high school, went to work at Ford Motor, and was a model employee at Ford. He did everything he was told to do. And one day he came home from work on a Friday evening. His father came home intoxicated and began to beat on his mother. He walked into the other room, picked up a gun, walked in and shot his father dead with no emotion whatsoever, just shot him dead. Now that's what could happen with somebody who was a totally compliant child, who was fearful of ever resisting or rebelling in any way, is that they just are in trouble. It's like a bomb in there that's wanting to explode because they never let it out. Everybody thought they were the perfect person. They were kind, courteous, quiet, agreeable, would do anything that anybody wanted done, very helpful, and then bang, the big blow up. Now there are drugs that on the market today, psychiatric drugs, that can release some of that stuff sometimes, and there can be a big explosion. And that's for another time and another subject. We've talked a little about that already. But anyhow, that's what could happen with something like that. Now there is a third way of rebellion, but it's kind of comical in a way. And the third one is that your mother says, go clean your room. Okay, Mom, I'll go clean it right up. She comes back 2 hours later and nothing's done. And she says, I thought I told you to clean up your room. And he said, okay, Mom, I will. I'll do it right now. And she goes away, and pretty soon it's bedtime, and he goes to bed, and the room was never cleaned up. And that's the procrastinator. They keep agreeing, yes, I'll do it, but for some reason they can't get around to doing it ever. And on a deeper level, it's a way of rebelling, but not rebelling. It's kind of a soft rebellion. So procrastinators don't want to be told what to do, and they don't want to be controlled and run and so forth, but they don't want the issues that could be raised if you say, no, I don't want to clean my room, which the rebellious child would do. And the natural child will probably clean it up at some point, but they may have fun with it because they like to play and have fun. You know, it's the real child. And so they may make a game out of it and make it fun. But they're not resisting it openly or even in a hidden way. They're not rebelling against it. In fact, their intent is not to rebel. It's if they don't get to it immediately, it's because they've got other things they're doing, but they'll get to it, and it's okay. They don't feel pushed. So, those are the three of the ego states that are involved in transsexual analysis. Now, if you can imagine that every person you meet has those three, and sometimes they might look like this. They usually stack them, parent, adult, child. And especially when we're doing transactions, you're seeing how they interact. Now, what can happen is that you can get, and I'll put this up so you can see it, you can see that there's a dark space on number 1 where the parent overlaps the adult. There's a dark space on number 2 where the child and adult overlap. And number 3, we can see where parent overlaps adult and child overlaps adult too. Now, what would you say? That's total contamination, which means that the adult never can operate free of the influence of both the parent and the child. Now, those people have a lot of trouble. There are people who their adult is contaminated by the child. They're usually not a big problem, except they're the ones that every time you want to do something, they want to play with it. They want to come in and make jokes about it. They want to have a good time with it. They want to play with it. And sometimes you can't even get a serious response from the person because the level of contamination could be higher. This just shows some, but it could be way up, or it could be that the adult is totally contaminated by the child or totally contaminated by the parent. I don't know if that's making sense to you or not, but that is where so many people get to. Okay, so I think we're at the end of our time. So I guess we're going to have to continue this the next time, but we've got several more pieces of this. We want to talk more about the okayness, and we want to talk more about the victim triangle, or the, it's called the Karpman triangle, because a therapist by the name of Karpman developed the idea, and so we'll be covering that, and we'll talk some more about books. And other one you may really want to get before then is called Mind Programming. I've mentioned it before, by Eldon Taylor. And it tells you how people's minds can get programmed, because it can keep going on later in life even. But there's a lot of good information in there about mind programming, and the negative side of it and the positive side of it. When you consciously are utilizing these principles to improve yourself, then mind programming is good. When other people are using it to manipulate you, then it's probably not quite so good, especially depending on what they're manipulating you into. Okay, so the next time we definitely are going to get into transactions, and I'll just show you what some transactions look like. You can see two groups, those are two people interacting. And so we'll tell you what a transaction is, a complementary transaction, a cross transaction, and another sneaky one that we'll talk about, where it seems to be one thing, but it's really something else. And otherwise, I guess I've given you enough to start wrestling with, but we want you to understand how we think the way we do, and what we can do to free ourselves from a lot of the garbage, and what we could do as a society to have a working society where people could be different, yet they could work in a harmonious way together. But as long as we're hung up on all this garbage and no one is getting rid of it, we've got some other major issues or problems to deal with. So it was nice being with you again. Go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and be looking for number 2 next week, where we'll carry this further. We may be able to conclude it. 3 gets awfully long, and as I say, sometimes people won't want to follow through. So at this point, we'll try to conclude it with the next one, but at least give you enough to get you started. So otherwise, be healthy, and we'll look forward to being with you next time.